Tonight, we cross a threshold, not a physical doorway made of stone or wood, but something older, a passage made of memory and forgetting, of questions that have no answers and silences that speak more eloquently than words. We are entering the world of what was lost, the civilizations that rose in splendor and fell into dust, the knowledge that was gathered across centuries and scattered in single afternoons, the voices that once filled temples and marketplaces, that sang prayers and told stories, that whispered secrets and shouted proclamations, all now silent, all now waiting in the ruins for someone to remember. This is not a journey of conquest or discovery in the usual sense. We are not seeking treasure or glory. We are seeking something softer, something more elusive, the texture of forgetting itself, the shape of absence, the weight of what is no longer there. We want to know what it felt like to stand in a library before it burned, to walk through a city before it sank beneath the waves, to read a script before the last person who understood it drew their final breath. The ancient world was not silent. It hummed with life, with commerce and prayer, with the footsteps of millions going about their daily tasks. Children played in streets that are now archaeological sites. Merchants argued over prices in markets that are now empty fields. Priests chanted hymns in temples that are now scattered stones. All that activity, all that noise, all that vibrant living, where did it go? The people are gone. The sounds have faded. But something remains. Something always remains. What remains is what we seek tonight. Not facts alone, though we will encounter many. Not dates and names, though these have their place. What we seek is the feeling of touching something ancient, of standing in the presence of mysteries that were ancient when Rome was young, of recognizing that we too are temporary, that our cities too will someday be ruins, that our voices too will fade into the silence that receives all human sound. So let the evening deepen, let the world outside grow quiet, let the concerns of the day settle like sediment in still water. We are going somewhere old tonight, somewhere half remembered, somewhere that exists in the space between history and dream. The doorway stands open, the forgotten world awaits, and all we need to do is step through, gently, quietly, as if entering a sacred space where even our breathing should be soft. Come, the journey begins. We begin beneath the waves, where stone streets lie silent under fathoms of Mediterranean blue, where temple columns stand encrusted with barnacles and sea anemones, where marble that once gleamed in sunlight now knows only the filtered green of deep water, where a city sleeps in salt and darkness, waiting for no one, remembered by few, forgotten by most. The city was called Helike. It stood on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, in that region of ancient Greece called Achaia. For centuries it flourished, a prosperous city-state, home to temples and markets, to philosophers and fishermen, to all the ordinary and extraordinary activities that make a city live. The temple of Poseidon was especially renowned, drawing pilgrims from across the Greek world who came to honor the god of the sea, to make offerings, to seek blessings for voyages and harvests, and all the uncertain enterprises that depend on forces beyond human control. The irony would be noted by later generations, though it brought no comfort, for it was Poseidon, or so the Greeks believed, who destroyed the city that honored him. In the winter of 373 BC, in the dark hours before dawn, the earth began to shake. The trembling started softly, a vibration felt more than heard, a warning that most sleepers incorporated into their dreams without waking. But the shaking grew stronger, walls cracked, pottery fell from shelves, and shattered on stone floors. And then came the sound, a deep groaning from beneath the earth, as if the world itself were in pain, as if something massive and terrible were stirring in depths where no light reached. What happened next occurred so quickly that few had time to understand, let alone to flee. The earthquake had done its damage, but the earthquake was only beginning. The sea withdrew, pulled back from the shore as if taking a breath, exposing seabed that had not seen air in human memory, leaving fish flopping in sudden moonlight, revealing the bones of ships long sunk and forgotten. Those who saw the withdrawal and understood its meaning had perhaps a few minutes to run toward higher ground. Most did not understand. Most stood watching the strange spectacle, the impossible retreat of water, wondering what it meant. And then the sea returned. The tsunami struck Helike with force beyond measurement, beyond comprehension. Walls built to last centuries collapsed in seconds. Temples that had stood for generations were swept away like children's toys. The water did not merely flood the city, it erased it, carrying buildings and bodies and everything that had made Helig a living place out into the gulf, or pushing them down into mud that would seal over them like a closing eye. By the time dawn came, there was nothing. Where a city had stood the evening before, there was only water, still churning with debris, still carrying away the last traces of lives interrupted mid-dream. 10 days later, according to the ancient sources, a rescue expedition arrived from a neighboring city. They came in boats, searching for survivors, for bodies, for anything that might be saved. But they found nothing. The water had claimed everything. Looking down through the waves, they could see, or thought they could see, the shapes of buildings below, the outlines of streets, perhaps even the shadows of bodies that would never receive proper burial. The city that had been so vibrant, so full of life and commerce and worship, had become a ghost beneath the waves. The story of Helike haunted the Greek imagination. Writers referenced it as example of divine anger and human fragility. Philosophers used it to illustrate the impermanence of worldly achievement. The geographer Strabo wrote of visiting the site 4 centuries after the disaster, of local guides pointing to the Gulf and telling the old stories, of fishermen who avoided certain waters where their nets came up torn on underwater ruins. The Roman writer Aelian reported that a bronze statue of Poseidon from Helike's temple had been pulled up by fishermen's nets. The god of the sea, reclaimed from the sea, he had weaponized against his own worshippers. But as centuries passed, even the memory faded. The exact location of Helik was forgotten. Later generations wondered if the city had been real at all, or if it was merely legend, merely cautionary tale invented to teach lessons about pride and divine retribution. The ruins, if they existed, lay hidden beneath water, and then, as the coastline shifted, beneath layers of river sediment that buried them deeper still. Helik became one of those lost places that scholars debated and romantics dreamed of, a sunken city that might be real, might be myth, might be something in between. It was not until 2001 that archaeologists finally located Helik. Using sonar and careful excavation, they found the city not beneath the sea, but beneath a plain. The gulf had receded over millennia, leaving Helike buried under 13 feet of earth. A city that drowned then was buried, that was lost twice, that had to be found beneath ground, that had once been sea floor. The discoveries continue. Coins emerge from the earth. Pottery shards tell stories. The outlines of streets can be traced. The city that slipped into the sea is slowly revealing itself, giving up secrets it has kept for nearly 2,500 years. But what can the excavations truly tell us? They can show us where the building stood. They can reveal what the people owned, what they ate, what gods they worshipped. But they cannot tell us what it felt like to be there on that final night, cannot capture the terror of waking to shaking earth, the confusion of those who did not understand what was happening, the desperation of those who did, cannot preserve the prayers offered in final moments, the names called out into darkness, the hands that reached for other hands and found only water. We sit with the weight of this not knowing. The city is found, but its people remain lost. Their individual stories, the merchant who had just made a profitable trade, the mother who had tucked her children into bed, the priest who had performed the evening ritual, the fisherman who had mended his nets one last time. All these stories ended that night, ended without conclusion, ended mid-sentence in the grammar of existence. The water has no memory. The earth does not mourn. Only humans remember. And human memory is itself fragile, itself temporary, itself subject to erosion and burial and loss. We remember Helike because writers wrote about it, because the story was strange enough to preserve, because the destruction was complete enough to fascinate. But how many other cities have been lost without such commemoration? How many settlements have simply vanished, their names forgotten, their existence doubted, their stories absorbed into silence? The question has no answer, or its answer is countless. Countless cities have risen and fallen. Countless communities have flourished and disappeared. We know the famous losses: Pompeii, Atlantis if it existed, the cities of the Indus Valley, whose scripts we cannot read. But for every famous loss, there are hundreds, thousands, that left no trace. that vanished so completely that we do not even know to look for them, that exist now only in the gap between what was and what we can know. Halike reminds us of this fragility, reminds us that civilization is contingent, that cities are temporary arrangements, that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems. Reminds us, too, that memory itself requires effort, requires preservation, requires someone to tell the story and someone else to listen. Without the writers who recorded Halike's destruction, the city would be unknown. Its ruins, perhaps found someday by archaeologists who would not know what they had found, who would puzzle over the site without the context that ancient accounts provide. We close as night settles over the plain that was once seafloor, over the excavation site that was once city, over the silence that was once clamor of 10,000 lives, the city that slipped into the sea and was softly forgotten, found now, but still lost in all the ways that matter most, the individual lives, the final thoughts, the prayers that went unanswered, the morning that never came. Somewhere beneath the earth, beneath the sediment of centuries, beneath the weight of all that forgetting, the stones of Helite still lie arranged as they fell, still bear the scorch marks of ancient fires, the wear patterns of ancient footsteps, the evidence of lives lived in full confidence that tomorrow would come. The city sleeps, the excavations continue, and we who learn of it from comfortable distance are reminded that we too walk on ground that is not permanent, that we too live in cities that time will claim, that we too will be remembered only if someone chooses to remember, and only for as long as memory itself endures. The waves, the earthquake, the city that vanished in a night, forever warning us that nothing is forever, forever teaching us that beauty is fragile, forever asking us what we would save if we could, what we would remember if we had to choose, what we would want others to know about us when we too have become silence and ruin. Sleep approaches. The story of Helike settles into that place where memory lives, and beneath the plain that was once sea, the ancient city keeps its vigil, patient and permanent in its impermanence, lost and found, and lost again in the endless cycles of remembering and forgetting that make human history what it is. In museum cases around the world, small stone seals rest on velvet cushions beneath careful lighting. They are modest objects, rarely larger than a thumb, carved from steatite or clay, their surfaces bearing symbols pressed into stone 4,000 years ago by hands whose names we will never know. The symbols are clear. The craftsmanship is precise. The meaning is utterly lost. We have entered the mystery of the Indus Valley script, one of humanity's last undeciphered writing systems, a code that has resisted more than a century of scholarly effort, a language that speaks to us across millennia and says nothing we can understand. The civilization that created this script built some of the ancient world's most sophisticated cities. They engineered drainage systems that would not be matched for thousands of years. They created standardized weights and measures that suggest complex commerce. They traded with Mesopotamia and left their seals in distant lands. And yet they left us no literature we can read, no history we can follow, no prayers we can recite, no names we can speak. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization after one of its major sites, flourished from roughly 3300 to 1300 BC across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. At its height, it was one of the world's three great civilizations, contemporary with Egypt and Mesopotamia, but in some ways more advanced than either. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning, grid-patterned streets oriented to cardinal directions, houses built with standardized bricks, sophisticated sewage systems that connected individual homes to covered drains running along the streets. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, waterproofed with bitumen, speaks of ritual practices we can only guess at. The granaries suggest organized surplus management. The uniformity across sites suggests centralized authority, or at least shared cultural standards. But who were these people? We do not know. What language did they speak? We cannot be certain. What did they believe? We can only infer from images that might be religious or might be merely decorative. What were their laws, their stories, their names for themselves? The script that might tell us remains silent. The script appears on thousands of objects, mostly small seals used apparently for marking goods, but also on pottery, on tablets, on copper plates. The symbols number between 400 and 600 distinct signs, depending on how one counts variants. This is too many for an alphabet. English manages with 26 letters, but too few for a purely logographic system like Chinese, which requires thousands of characters. The consensus suggests that the Indus script was probably logosyllabic, combining symbols that represent whole words with symbols that represent sounds. This is similar to how Egyptian hieroglyphs and Sumerian cuneiform functioned. But knowing what type of script it was does not tell us how to read it. The fundamental problem is brevity. The average Indus inscription contains only 5 symbols. The longest known inscription contains only 26. There are no bilingual texts, no Rosetta Stone that would allow us to compare the unknown script with a known language. There are no clear images accompanied by labels that would let us match pictures with words. The seals show animals, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and humanoid figures in postures that might be ritual, might be narrative, might be neither. But we cannot be certain that the symbols next to these images name them. They might not. We cannot know. Scholars have proposed many theories. Some argue that the script encodes a Dravidian language related to Tamil and other languages still spoken in southern India. Others suggest it was Proto-Sanskrit, an ancestor of Hindi and Bengali and many other Indo-European languages. Still others propose it was a language isolate, related to no known family, as lost as the Sumerian language would be. If we could not read cuneiform, each theory has supporters and critics. None has achieved consensus. The script keeps its secrets. There is something poignant in this silence. The people who created this script wanted to communicate. They carved symbols carefully, pressed them into clay, used them to mark their goods and perhaps to record their thoughts. They expected to be understood by their contemporaries, certainly, and perhaps by some imagined future. They could not have known that their civilization would decline, that their cities would be abandoned, that their script would be forgotten so completely that even the most brilliant modern scholars would puzzle over it without success. They wrote, expecting to speak. They speak now, expecting to be heard, and we hear only the shape of sounds, the architecture of meaning, without the meaning itself. The decline of the Indus Valley civilization remains almost as mysterious as its script. Around 1900 BC, the great cities began to be abandoned. The population dispersed into smaller settlements. The sophisticated urban culture, the planned streets, the drainage systems, the standardized bricks disappeared. What caused the collapse? Theories proliferate. Climate change may have shifted the monsoon patterns, making agriculture more difficult. Rivers may have changed course, depriving cities of water. Disease may have spread through crowded urban populations. Conflict may have erupted. Perhaps all of these factors combined. What we know is that by 1300 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization as such had ended. Its people did not vanish. Their descendants almost certainly lived on, merged with other populations, contributed to the cultures that followed. But the specific cultural complex that had created those magnificent cities, that had developed that mysterious script, that had traded across the ancient world, this was gone. And with its going, the knowledge of how to read the script was lost. The last person who could decipher those symbols died sometime in the second millennium BCE, taking the key to the code into oblivion. We walk now through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in imagination. The streets are empty. The houses stand roofless, their bricks weathered by 4,000 years of monsoons and dry seasons. The great bath is dry, its waterproofing cracked, its ritual purpose forgotten. In the museum nearby, the seals rest in their cases. The unicorn seal, the bull seal, the seals bearing the mysterious figure seated in what might be yogic posture, what might be meditation, what might be something our categories cannot contain. The symbols on the seals are beautiful in their precision. The lines are clean. The forms are consistent. Someone cared about getting them right, about making them legible, about communicating clearly. That care survives in the craftsmanship, even as the communication itself has failed. The seals speak of intention without content, of meaning without message, of the desire to be understood, meeting the reality of being forgotten. This is perhaps the deepest mystery, not what the script says, but what it means that we cannot know what it says. The Indus Valley civilization was one of humanity's great achievements. Its cities housed perhaps 5 million people at their peak. Its influence extended across thousands of miles. Its innovations in urban planning would not be matched until the Roman Empire. And yet this civilization is voiceless. It exists for us only in its material remains, the bricks and the seals, the weights and the pottery, the physical objects that archaeology can recover. Its thoughts, its beliefs, its stories, its understanding of itself, all lost in the silence of an undeciphered script. We sit with this loss, feel its weight, recognize that it is not unique, that countless languages have died without leaving written trace, that countless scripts have been lost without being deciphered, that the Indus silence is exceptional only because we have the seals, we have the symbols, we have evidence of writing without the ability to read it. How many other writing systems were created and lost before they could be recorded? How many thoughts were written in mediums that did not survive? How many meanings have vanished? Not because we cannot decode them, but because no trace remains to decode. Perhaps someday the Indus script will be deciphered. Perhaps some discovery, a longer inscription, a bilingual text, a breakthrough in computational analysis will unlock the code. Perhaps future scholars will read what we cannot, will know what we can only guess at, will give voice to the silence that has lasted for millennia. But perhaps not. Perhaps the script will remain what it is now, beautiful, precise, and mute. Perhaps some knowledge is lost forever. Perhaps some doors, once closed, do not reopen. The seals rest in their cases. The symbols wait on stone. The civilization that created them has been dust for millennia, its cities excavated and catalogued, its people absorbed into populations that have no memory of them. But the script remains, evidence that they wanted to communicate, that they had something to say, that they reached toward posterity with carved symbols, hoping to be understood. We cannot give them the understanding they sought. We can only acknowledge the attempt, can only honor the intention, can only sit in the presence of mystery and feel what it means to stand before a locked door without a key, to hear a voice speaking words we cannot comprehend, to know that meaning exists without being able to access it. The Indus Valley script, the seals that crossed the ancient world, the symbols that no one living can read, forever asking to be understood, forever waiting for an answer that may never come, forever testimony to both human achievement and human loss, to how much can be built and how thoroughly it can be forgotten, to how precisely communication can be crafted and how completely it can fail. Sleep settles around us. The script waits in its silence, and somewhere in the depths of linguistic mystery, the voices of the Indus Valley civilization continue speaking, continue hoping to be heard, continue reaching toward understanding across the vast abyss of 4,000 years and countless generations of forgetting. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, buried beneath centuries of wind-blown sand, libraries wait. Scrolls that no one has touched for millennia rest in darkness, their papyrus dry and fragile, their ink faded, but perhaps still legible, their contents unknown because no one knows they exist. This is not fantasy. This is archaeological probability. The dry conditions that preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, that saved the Nag Hammadi texts, that kept the Villa of the Papyri's contents legible after volcanic burial. These same conditions exist across Egypt, across the ancient Near East, across any arid region where ancient peoples wrote and stored their writings. What waits beneath the sand? We cannot know until it is found, but we can imagine, can wonder, can contemplate what has been lost and what might, against all odd, remain. The ancient world was not illiterate. Writing spread across civilizations for millennia before the Common Era. Libraries accumulated in temple precincts and palace archives, in private homes and commercial establishments. The famous Library of Alexandria was merely the largest and most ambitious of countless collections. Every temple of any significance had its archive, every palace its records, every school its texts. The quantity of ancient writing produced was enormous. The quantity that survived is vanishingly small. Consider the mathematics of loss. Sophocles wrote over 100 plays. 7 survive complete. Aeschylus wrote between 70 and 90 plays. 7 survive. Euripides wrote 92 plays. 18 survive. For every Greek tragedy we can read, roughly 10 have vanished. The ratio is probably similar for comedy, for history, for philosophy, for poetry, for every genre of ancient literature. We read by candlelight what was written for full illumination, and we cannot even see the shadows of what has disappeared. Where did all those texts go? Fire took many. The burning of Alexandria, whether in a single conflagration or through repeated disasters over centuries, consumed scrolls that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. Wars destroyed libraries across the ancient world. The sack of Rome, the fall of Constantinople, the burning of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Each catastrophe erased knowledge that can never be recovered. But fire is not the only enemy. Neglect destroys more quietly. Papyrus decays in humid conditions. Parchment is eaten by insects. Books unread for generations are recycled, their texts scraped away to make room for new writing, their original contents preserved only as ghosts beneath palimpsest layers. And yet some texts survive. The Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1945 by Egyptian farmers digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi. Sealed in a clay jar, the codices had waited since the 4th century CE. Gnostic gospels and philosophical texts that transformed our understanding of early Christianity, that gave voice to traditions the church had suppressed, that emerged from the earth after 16 centuries of silence. The discovery was accidental. No one was looking for these texts. No one knew they existed. They simply emerged like offerings from the ground. like gifts from the past to the present. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1907 by a Bedouin shepherd searching for a lost goat in caves above the Dead Sea in the dry desert air. Scrolls had survived for 2,000 years. Biblical texts, community documents, calendars and rules and prayers. The discovery revolutionized biblical scholarship, provided our oldest copies of Hebrew scriptures, revealed the diversity of Jewish religious practice in the centuries before and after Jesus. Again, the discovery was accidental. The scrolls waited in darkness for anyone who might find them, patient in their fragility, preserved by conditions that turned what should have been decay into remarkable survival. The villa of the papyri at Herculaneum was buried by the same volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii in 79 CE. The villa's library contained over 1,800 scrolls, carbonized by volcanic heat into brittle cylinders that for centuries seemed impossible to read. But modern technology, multispectral imaging, artificial intelligence, patient analysis has begun to unlock these scrolls without unrolling them, revealing texts of Epicurean philosophy, works previously known only through fragments and references. The process is slow. The results are remarkable. Texts that had been effectively lost for 2 millennia are becoming readable again, speaking from volcanic preservation to digital reconstruction. What else waits to be found? The question haunts anyone who contemplates ancient literature. We know of libraries that existed and were lost. We know of texts that were referenced by other authors but did not survive. We know that the random process of preservation was influenced by factors having nothing to do with quality or importance, that what survived was what happened to be copied at the right time, stored in the right place, fortunate in its fragility. The lost texts might have been masterpieces. The lost libraries might have contained revelations. We cannot know because they are lost. But the desert remembers. The dry sand preserves what moisture would destroy. Somewhere beneath Egyptian dunes, beneath Mesopotamian tells, beneath the accumulated sediment of millennia, papyrus and parchment and clay tablets wait. Not all have been destroyed. Not all have decayed. Some, we cannot know how many, remain legible, waiting for the accident that will bring them to light. Archaeologists search systematically, of course. They excavate known sites, probe likely locations, use ground penetrating radar and satellite imagery to identify buried structures. But the great discoveries often come by chance. The farmer digging for fertilizer, the shepherd seeking his goat, the construction project that uncovers ancient foundations, the erosion that reveals what was hidden. These accidents have given us more than deliberate searching in many cases. The past reveals itself on its own schedule, offers its gifts when it chooses, keeps its secrets until conditions are right. We sit with the possibility, the hope that is not quite hope, but something quieter. Acknowledgement that we do not know what we do not know, that our understanding of the ancient world is shaped by the accidents of preservation, that what we think we know might be transformed by a single discovery, a single scroll, a single library emerging from the sand. What would we want to find? The lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, certainly. The histories of Mesopotamian dynasties, written in their own words. The religious texts of traditions that left only archaeological traces. The scientific treatises that might have accelerated our knowledge by centuries. The personal letters and diaries that would humanize people we know only through official records. The children's lessons and shopping lists and love poems that would reveal ordinary life beneath the extraordinary monuments. But perhaps what we would find would surprise us, would not fit our categories, would reveal aspects of ancient life we never imagined, would force us to reconsider what we thought we knew. The Nag Hammadi texts did this for early Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls did this for Second Temple Judaism. Every major textual discovery has expanded our understanding, not just by adding information, but by revealing that our previous understanding was incomplete, was shaped by the accidents of what survived, was narrower than the reality it claimed to represent. The sand shifts in desert wind. The buried libraries wait in their darkness. The scrolls that might be there or might not be, we cannot know. Keep their patience, keep their silence, keep whatever knowledge they contain, sealed against the centuries. We close contemplating this patience. The ancient texts do not care if they are found, do not know they are waiting, simply exist or do not exist, preserved or destroyed. Their survival dependent on conditions that have nothing to do with human intention or human value. The library beneath the sand is metaphor as much as possibility, metaphor for all that is lost, for the vastness of human cultural production that has now not survived, for the humility required when we realize how little we actually know of ancient worlds that produced so much we can never access. And yet, people keep searching, keep digging, keep hoping that the next excavation will reveal something wonderful, that the next accident will uncover something transformative. The faith that the past has more to give, that the silence is not complete, that somewhere beneath the sand, the ancient world still speaks, waiting only for someone to listen. The library beneath the sand, the scrolls that might exist, the knowledge that waits for discovery, forever possible, forever uncertain, forever reminding us that the past is never fully past, that what was written can outlast its writers by millennia, that hope for recovery is not unreasonable even when evidence is absent. The sand, the waiting, the beautiful uncertainty, forever the territory of dreams and scholarship alike, where what we wish we could find and what we might actually find exist in suspension, in possibility, in the quiet patience of preservation that does not know it is preservation, in the survival that is simply waiting to be discovered. Before telescopes existed, before mathematics as we know it was developed, before anyone had circumnavigated the globe or calculated its dimensions with precision, ancient peoples watched the sky. They watched with patience we can barely imagine, with attention sustained across generations, with the understanding that celestial patterns mattered for agriculture, for navigation, for religion, for understanding their place in a cosmos that turned above them nightly, that marked the seasons, that seemed to speak. If only they could learn to listen. We enter now the sacred observatories of the ancient world, not as museums of primitive science, but as temples where heaven met earth, where astronomical knowledge and religious devotion were not separate endeavors, but the same endeavor, where watching the stars was simultaneously practical and sacred. Begin at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the massive temple complex built in the early 12th century, but drawing on astronomical traditions far older, is aligned with extraordinary precision. At the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over the central tower when viewed from the western entrance, a moment that modern tourists photograph without necessarily understanding its ancient significance. The temple's layout encodes cosmological understanding. The moat represents the cosmic ocean. The towers represent the peaks of Mount Meru. At the universe's center, the galleries are oriented to the cardinal directions with accuracy that suggests sophisticated surveying techniques. Angkor Wat is temple, but it is also astronomical instrument, calendar in stone, statement about the relationship between earthly rule and cosmic order. Move now to Egypt, to the Great Pyramid at Giza. The pyramid's base is aligned to true north with an accuracy of better than 1/10 of a degree, remarkable for any construction, extraordinary for one built 45 centuries ago. But more intriguing are the shafts extending from the king's chamber and queen's chamber, narrow passages too small for humans, pointing toward specific regions of the sky. One shaft aligned to the transit point of Orion's belt, associated with Osiris, god of the dead. Another aligned to the star Sirius, associated with Isis. Whether these shafts were meant to guide the pharaoh's soul to the stars, to bring starlight into the pyramid's heart, or to serve some purpose we cannot fathom, they demonstrate astronomical knowledge and intention far beyond what is needed for mere construction. Travel now to the Yucatan Peninsula, to the Maya city of Chichen Itza. The caracol, Spanish for snail, named for its internal spiral staircase, is an observatory built around 800 CE. Its windows do not face the cardinal directions, but are oriented to specific astronomical events. The northernmost and southernmost positions of Venus on the horizon, points of solstice, sunrise, and sunset. The Maya tracked Venus with obsessive precision, correlating its appearances with warfare, believing that the planet's movements signaled auspicious or dangerous times for military campaigns. Their Dresden Codex contains Venus tables accurate enough to predict the planet's positions centuries in advance without telescopes. without written mathematics as we know it, with only observation, record keeping, and pattern recognition sustained across generations. How did they achieve such accuracy? We do not fully know. We know they watched over lifetimes, watched over generations, accumulated observations that gradually revealed patterns too slow for any individual to perceive. We know they recorded in stone, in aligned buildings, in codices that mostly did not survive the Spanish conquest. We know they calculated, though their mathematics differed from ours, using systems that modern scholars have only partially reconstructed. And we know they cared enough to invest enormous resources in astronomical infrastructure, cared enough to train specialist priests who devoted lives to watching the sky, cared enough to believe that celestial events mattered for earthly affairs. The relationship between astronomy and religion was not incidental, but fundamental. For most ancient peoples, the sky was not merely backdrop, but agent, not merely pattern, but meaning. The sun was often God or manifestation of God. The moon governed tides and perhaps fertility. The planets, wandering stars that moved against the fixed background, must have significance, must be messages or messengers. The stars themselves, wheeling around the pole in nightly procession, seemed to enact a cosmic dance whose steps could be learned if one watched carefully enough. This is why observatories were temples. This is why astronomical knowledge was priestly knowledge. The people who watched the stars were not scientists in our sense, not seeking neutral understanding of natural phenomena, but mediators between human and divine, translators of celestial language, keepers of knowledge too sacred and too important to be widely shared. The priest who could predict an eclipse held power beyond mere calculation. He seemed to know what gods intended. He could interpret heaven's will. We pause to consider what this meant for ordinary people. They did not watch the skies themselves, mostly. They worked in fields and workshops, raised children, navigated the concerns of daily life. But they lived in a world where the sky mattered, where their rulers claimed celestial authority, where the patterns above seemed to mirror and perhaps determine patterns below. Their experience of astronomy was mediated through temples and priests, through festivals that marked solstices and equinoxes, through calendars that organized their labor and their worship. The knowledge itself is remarkable. Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, calculated Earth's circumference using nothing but observation of sun angles at different latitudes and knowledge of the distance between measurement points. His result was accurate to within perhaps 2% of modern measurements. No telescopes, no satellites, no technology beyond measuring sticks and patient observation, just intelligence applied to evidence, pattern recognized across space, mathematics that transformed local observations into global understanding. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck in 1901, is an astronomical computer dating to the 2nd century BCE. its bronze gears, corroded but reconstructible, calculated lunar phases, solar eclipses, positions of the 5 planets known to ancient Greeks. The device is so sophisticated that nothing comparable would be built for over 1,000 years. We do not know who made it. We do not know how the knowledge to create it was developed or why it was not preserved. The mechanism sits in museum cases, testifying to capabilities that were achieved, then lost, then slowly recovered over millennia. What did ancient peoples feel when they looked at the sky? We cannot fully know, cannot recover the awe of seeing the Milky Way unpolluted by artificial light, the countless stars visible in pre-industrial darkness, cannot feel what it meant to believe that those points of light were not merely distant suns, but were gods, were ancestors, were sacred presences watching over human affairs, cannot understand what it meant to track celestial patterns, not from curiosity alone, but from conviction that the patterns mattered, that understanding them was essential to understanding existence itself. We close at dusk in an ancient observatory, perhaps Stonehenge, perhaps the Caracol, perhaps some unnamed ruin where astronomical alignments can still be measured. The sun descends toward alignment with stones placed millennia ago. The stars emerge one by one, the same stars, or nearly the same, allowing for precession that ancient astronomers watched, the same patterns they mapped, the same cosmos they tried to understand, the temple where stars were measured, the observatory that was also altar, the priests who watched heaven to understand earth, the knowledge that was practical and sacred simultaneously, the precision achieved without modern instruments, the patience sustained across generations. All of this survives in aligned stones and astronomical codices in buildings oriented to celestial events, in the remarkable accuracy that ancient peoples achieved through methods we cannot fully reconstruct. And above us, the stars continue their ancient wheel. The same light that fell on Stonehenge's builders falls on us. The same patterns that Maya astronomers tracked continue their cycles. The universe has not changed. Only we have changed, have learned to see stars as distant suns rather than sacred presences, have gained instruments that extend sight beyond imagination, have lost the integration of knowledge and worship that made astronomy sacred, the temple where stars were measured, forever aligned to heaven, forever testifying to ancient attention, forever asking what we have gained and what we have lost in the long journey from sacred watching to scientific observation. The stars, the stones, the patient measuring, forever speaking of human desire to understand the cosmos, to find meaning in patterns, to connect earthly existence to celestial order, forever ancient, forever continuing, forever the same sky watched by different eyes across the ages. The road stretches toward horizon, straight as intention, paved with stones, fitted so precisely that even after 2,000 years, water drains between them rather than pooling, that wheels still find smooth passage, that the engineering endures when the purpose has long faded. This is a Roman road, one of thousands that once crossed an empire spanning 3 continents, connecting provinces to capital, carrying legions and merchants and ideas at speeds the ancient world had never known. But where does this road lead? The milestone is there, eroded but legible, marking distance to a city whose name survives in documents, but whose location is uncertain, whose buildings have been quarried for other construction, whose population dispersed centuries ago, whose market and forum and temple are now fields or foundations, silent beneath soil that has no memory of what grew there. We follow roads tonight that lead nowhere anyone now remembers. Not because the destinations never existed, but because existence is more fragile than stone, because cities can vanish more completely than the roads that connected them. The Romans built 50,000 miles of paved roads, perhaps 250,000 miles, including unpaved routes. The roads were military necessity. Legions could march 20 miles per day on good road, could reach frontier crises in weeks rather than months, could maintain control over vast territory because distance was less enemy when the way was prepared. But military roads became commercial arteries. Merchants followed where soldiers led. Trade flourished because the roads made trade practical, made distances measurable, made schedules predictable. The Via Appia runs southeast from Rome toward Brindisi, where ships departed for Greece and the East. Begun in 312 BCE, it was one of the earliest Roman roads and remained one of the most important. Its paving stones are still visible in places, still bearing the wheel ruts of ancient carts, still following the route that Roman engineers surveyed 23 centuries ago. The tombs along the road, Roman custom placed burials outside city walls, along major roads where the dead could be commemorated by travelers, still stand in various states of preservation, monuments to individuals whose names we can sometimes read, whose lives we cannot recover. But the Via Appia is famous, preserved, maintained. Other roads have faded. The routes that crossed Gaul and Germania, that climbed British hills, that traversed North African deserts. Many survive only as traces, visible from air as crop marks, detectable through archaeology. Their paving stones long since removed for other construction, their routes forgotten and then rediscovered by scholars tracing faint evidence across landscapes. The roads led somewhere. Every milestone marked distance to destination that existed, that mattered, that people wanted to reach. The destinations were cities, markets, ports, shrines, places where things happened, where goods were exchanged, where gods were worshipped, where people gathered in numbers that made gathering worthwhile. The roads were not built in abstraction, but for specific purposes, connecting specific places that are sometimes now unknown. Consider a road in North Africa that once connected Leptis Magna to interior settlements. Leptis Magna survives. Its ruins are spectacular, among the best preserved Roman remains anywhere, testimony to the wealth and ambition of this Libyan coastal city. But what of the settlements the road reached? Some are known to archaeology, others are names in inscriptions without identified locations. Others are simply unknown, places that existed, that traded with Leptis Magna, that required road connection, that have now vanished into the desert, erased by sand and time, and the simple forgetting that claims everything not actively remembered. The Incas built roads too, 25,000 miles, connecting their empire from Colombia to Chile, crossing mountain passes above 15,000 feet, spanning chasms with rope bridges, linking coastal deserts to highland capitals to Amazon edge. The roads were for communication more than commerce. The Inca lacked wheels and draft animals, carried goods on human backs or on llamas, sent messages through relay runners who could cover extraordinary distances through their system of way stations. The roads connected Cusco to distant provinces, tied the empire together through infrastructure that made distance manageable. But what did the roads connect? The Inca kept records on quipus, knotted strings whose knots encoded information, whose reading was specialized knowledge, whose interpretation is still debated. We do not know the names of most Inca cities in the Inca language. We know them, if at all, through Spanish records or through archaeology. The roads lead to ruins whose original names are lost, to sites whose significance is uncertain, to places that clearly mattered. The roads would not have been built otherwise, but whose mattering we cannot fully reconstruct. The Silk Road was not single road, but network, and its destinations were way stations in longer journeys rather than endpoints. Yet, even here, the pattern holds. Some oasis cities survive or are well documented, others have vanished, swallowed by shifting deserts, abandoned when water sources failed, destroyed by wars that left no chroniclers. The road led through places that no longer exist, past cities whose names are guessed at or unknown, across landscapes that have changed enough that the road itself cannot always be traced. What does it mean to follow a road that leads nowhere? It means recognizing that purpose is historical, that infrastructure outlasts intention, that what seems permanent, even stone laid to endure, is actually embedded in context that does not endure. The road was built to go somewhere. That somewhere shaped the road's route, its engineering, its construction. Now, the somewhere is gone and the road remains, artifact of connection that no longer connects, testimony to importance that can no longer be assessed. We walk such roads in imagination, feel the stones beneath our feet, fitted by workers whose names are not recorded, transported from quarries whose locations are sometimes unknown. See the milestones marking distance to destinations that have become questions rather than answers. Pass through landscapes that were villages or farms or military installations that are now fields or forests or suburbs that bear no trace of what the road once served. The experience is melancholy, but also peaceful. The road remains. The engineering endures. Whatever was going on in the empire that built this road, the politics, the economics, the daily concerns of millions, is gone, but the road remains. Whatever urgent messages were carried, whatever armies marched, whatever merchants calculated profits, all specific content has vanished. But the infrastructure that enabled all of it still lies across the landscape, patient and purposeless, enduring beyond its use. Perhaps there is wisdom in this persistence. The road does not care where it leads, does not require its destinations to survive, simply exists, product of labor and intention that have now ceased, testimony to human capability and human impermanence simultaneously. The workers who laid these stones are dust. The engineers who surveyed the route are forgotten. The destinations that justified the effort have mostly vanished, but the road remains. The stones are still precisely fitted. The drainage still functions. The engineering still impresses. We close as dusk settles over an ancient road, its surface golden in low light, its extent invisible beyond curves and rises. The road leads somewhere, leads to wherever its servures intended, wherever its milestones marked, wherever ancient travelers were heading when they set out. But we do not know where, cannot follow to conclusion, can only appreciate the journey without understanding the destination. The roads that led nowhere anyone now remembers. The engineering that outlasted purpose. The infrastructure that survives intent. Forever testimony to connection that no longer connects. Forever evidence of destinations that no longer exist. Forever teaching us that even our own roads will someday lead nowhere, that our own cities will someday be ruins or less than ruins, that what we build in confidence of permanence will be overtaken by forgetting as surely as these ancient roads have been. The stone, the route, the distance measured to places unknown. Forever, the shape of human ambition meeting the reality of human transience. Forever, the road remaining when the destinations are gone. A Roman coin in a Japanese tomb. A Chinese coin in East African ruin. An Athenian owl in an Indian temple offering. These objects should not be where they are, should not have crossed the distances, should not have survived the centuries, should not be sitting in museum cases far from anywhere their makers imagined them going. Yet there they are, evidence of connections that ancient people never documented, of journeys that no one recorded, of hands passing to hands in transactions we cannot reconstruct. We enter the mystery of objects that traveled farther than their makers dreamed. The coins that crossed the world. A coin is portable wealth, standardized value, trust made metal. When governments mint coins, they're making claims about their authority to guarantee value, about their power to enforce acceptance, about their position in networks of exchange. When coins travel beyond the territories of their issuers, they become something else. They become evidence of trade, of trust extended across cultural boundaries, of value recognized independent of political authority. The Roman coin accepted in India testifies to Rome's reputation, to silver's inherent worth, to commercial relationships that bridged vast distances. The Romans knew they traded with the East. Pliny complained about gold draining toward India and China to pay for silk and spices. The trade was substantial enough to concern moralists and economists, but the extent of the connections, how far Roman goods actually traveled, how complex the networks were, is revealed more by archaeology than by ancient texts. When Roman coins appear in India, when Roman glass appears in Korea, when Roman jewelry appears in Japan, we learn that the actual trade was more extensive than the records suggest. How did a Roman coin reach Japan? We cannot know the specific route. Perhaps it traveled with a Roman merchant to India, was traded there, changed hands through Southeast Asia, crossed to China, crossed again to Korea, crossed finally to Japan. Each exchange logical in itself, the total distance accumulating through successive transactions. Perhaps it traveled differently. Perhaps it was carried by a single extraordinary traveler whose journey no one documented. Perhaps it was heirloom, kept for generations, its origin a story told and then forgotten. The coin cannot tell us. It can only testify that somehow, through some sequence of human decisions, it crossed the world. The same is true of Chinese goods in Roman territory, of Indian goods in Mediterranean contexts, of Viking materials in Byzantine collections. The trade networks of the ancient world were more complex, more extensive, more entangled than any single text reveals. The objects themselves are the evidence, silent witnesses to connections that were not always recorded, to relationships that left no documentation, to exchanges that seemed ordinary to participants and now seem extraordinary to us. Consider the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Roman merchant's guide to Indian Ocean trade from the 1st century CE. It describes ports, goods, sailing seasons, dangers, opportunities. It mentions silk from China, spices from India, incense from Arabia, ivory from Africa. It treats long distance trade as normal, as practical, as subject to the ordinary calculations of risk and profit. For the merchant who wrote it, these connections were business. For us, they are windows into a world far more connected than we often imagine. The coins tell specific stories we cannot read. This denarius was minted in Rome in a specific year, under a specific emperor, with a specific message stamped on its face. It circulated for some time in Roman territory. The wear patterns testify to handling, to exchange, to presence in ordinary commerce. Then, somehow, it left the empire. Was it payment for goods? Gift to foreign ruler? Random loss by traveler? The coin does not say. It simply traveled, survived, emerged in excavation far from its origin, evidence of connection without context. The connections worked both ways. Roman territory received goods from across the world: silk from China, pepper from India, cinnamon from somewhere. Ancient texts disagreed about where. Gems and woods, and animals and textiles. The demand for exotic goods drove the trade, created profits that justified the risks, linked economies across distances that must have seemed impossible to most people who never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplaces. But not just goods traveled, ideas traveled with merchants. Buddhism spread along trade routes, carried by monks who followed commercial networks, established as in communities that served traveling merchants, transmitted through the same channels that transmitted silk and spices. Christianity spread similarly through Mediterranean trade networks, finding converts in port cities and commercial centers, following the roads and sea lanes that connected the Roman world. The trade routes were idea routes, religion routes, technology routes. The merchants who carried goods carried culture, whether they intended to or not. The objects in museums bear witness to all of this. The Buddhist statue, made in Greek steel, in Gandhara, showing how Greek artistic traditions traveled to Central Asia and merged with Indian religious traditions. The Chinese porcelain, found in African ruins, showing how blue and white ceramics became valued far from their origin. The gold ornaments, combining motifs from multiple traditions, showing how craftsmen drew on influences from across their connected world. We sit with one such object, let us say a coin, small enough to hold between thumb and finger, heavy with precious metal, stamped with the face of an emperor dead 2,000 years. The coin has traveled, has been held by countless hands, has purchased goods we cannot know, has facilitated transactions we cannot reconstruct, has crossed boundaries that no longer exist, has survived catastrophes that destroyed everything around it. The coin is evidence, is testimony, is message in a language we can partly read and partly only guess at. What was the world like when this coin was minted? We can answer with historical facts, emperors and wars, trade volumes, and political arrangements. But we cannot answer with experience, cannot feel what it felt like to hold this coin when it was new, to be part of the networks that carried it, to live in a world where such connections seemed ordinary, even if remarkable. The coin has survived, but its context has not. The metal endures, but the meaning requires reconstruction. The coins that crossed the world, the objects that traveled farther than imagination, the evidence of connection without documentation of connection, forever asking how it happened, what routes were taken, what hands passed to what hands, forever reminding us that the ancient world was not isolated, that distances we consider vast were crossed routinely, that human desire for exchange, for goods, for ideas, for contact with the distant and exotic has driven connection across all recorded history. We close holding imaginary coin, feeling its weight, contemplating its journey. Somewhere this coin was minted, somewhere it was spent, somewhere it accumulated the wear that testifies to use, somewhere it crossed the boundary between expected and extraordinary, leaving the territory where it was familiar for territory where it was curiosity. And somewhere, perhaps in earth still unexcavated, perhaps in collections still uncatalogued, other coins wait, other evidence of connection, other testimony to a world more linked than we knew. The coins, the journeys, the connections that left no records except the objects themselves, forever traveling, forever arriving, forever speaking of human interconnection across the ages, above the clouds, where air grows thin and ordinary sounds fall silent. Certain mountains were sacred, not merely high places. Not every peak was holy, but specific mountains where something concentrated, where divine presence seemed to dwell, where pilgrims climbed seeking what could not be found below. The mountain where gods once spoke. Mount Olympus rises above the clouds of northern Greece, its peaks wreathed in weather that ancient Greeks saw as divine veil, concealing the dwelling places of Zeus and Hera, of Apollo and Athena, of the pantheon that ruled heaven and earth. Mortals did not climb Olympus seeking the gods. The gods were not to be approached uninvited, were dangerous in their power, were to be worshipped from below through sacrifice and prayer. The mountain was sacred because it was forbidden, because its heights were divine territory, because the clouds that hid its summit were understood as boundary between mortal and immortal worlds. Mount Sinai, wherever exactly it was, for scholars still debate the location, was the mountain where Moses received the law, where thunder and lightning signaled divine presence, where ordinary mortals could not approach on pain of death. The mountain trembled, the clouds descended. God spoke. The tablets of the covenant were inscribed. The mountain was holy ground, and even the mountain itself was to be touched only by those God designated. Mount Kailash rises in western Tibet, sacred to Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and followers of Bon, circumambulated by pilgrims who walk 52 kilometers around its base but never attempt its summit. For Hindus, Kailash is the abode of Shiva, where the great god sits in meditation, where the Ganges begins its celestial descent. For Buddhists, it is the center of the universe. No one has climbed Kailash, not because it is technically impossible, but because it is spiritually unthinkable, because the mountain's sanctity prohibits ascent, because to climb would be sacrilege against multiple traditions. Mount Fuji, that perfect volcanic cone visible from Tokyo on clear days, drew pilgrims for centuries before modern tourism made ascent a recreational activity. The pilgrims climbed in white robes, purified themselves at stations along the route, reached the summit as spiritual achievement rather than athletic accomplishment. The mountain was deity, not dwelling place of deity, but deity itself. The volcano's power understood as sacred presence. What makes a mountain sacred? Height matters, certainly. The distance from ordinary ground to summit creates sense of approach to something beyond ordinary. Difficulty matters. The effort of climbing becomes spiritual discipline, purification through exertion. Isolation matters. The mountain's separation from surrounding landscape creates sense of distinct territory. But these factors do not explain why some mountains become sacred and others, equally high and difficult and isolated, do not. Something else operates, something we might call concentration of numinous presence or historical accumulation of sacred regard, or simply the mystery of why certain places feel holy when others do not. The sacred mountains were discovered to be sacred, their holiness perceived rather than projected, and once discovered, their sanctity was reinforced through generations of pilgrimage, through stories told and rituals performed, through the gradual accumulation of sacred associations that made the mountain itself resonant with meaning. The ascent was transformative. Pilgrims who climbed sacred mountains were understood to be approaching divine presence, leaving ordinary reality for territory where different rules applied. The thin air created altered states. Oxygen deprivation produces euphoria and hallucination, which could be understood as spiritual experience. The physical difficulty created readiness for transformation. The body's exhaustion opening the spirit to experiences unavailable in comfort. The view from summit suggested perspective unavailable below, suggested that ordinary concerns were small, that larger patterns existed, that the God's eye view revealed what human eye could not see. We imagine climbing such a mountain, feel the path steepen beneath our feet, the air thin with each step, the sounds of ordinary world fade below. We pass stations of pilgrimage, shrines where offerings are made, resting places where prayers are offered, markers of spiritual progress measured in altitude and difficulty. Other pilgrims climb with us, some faster, some slower, all sharing the journey, all seeking what the mountain represents. The summit approaches. The cloud layer is below us now. We have entered the divine territory that ancient peoples saw as boundary. The ordinary world is invisible, lost in white sea of cloud that stretches to horizon. Only the peak rises above. Only we and other pilgrims share this elevated space. The silence is profound. No bird song at this altitude, no insect hum, only wind and heartbeat and breath. What did pilgrims experience at such summits? Some reported visions of deities, of ancestors, of truths revealed through the mountain's grace. Some reported only exhaustion and awe, the simple, overwhelming fact of having arrived, of standing where the sacred dwelt. Some reported peace, the concerns that had driven them to pilgrimage, somehow resolved or at least suspended in the summit's presence. The experiences varied, but the mountain remained constant, receiving pilgrim after pilgrim across centuries, silent in its holiness, patient in its reception of human seeking. The descent was dangerous. Many mountain accidents happen on the way down, when exhaustion compromises judgment, when the achievement of summit encourages carelessness. The pilgrims descended back into ordinary world, carrying whatever the mountain had given, changed in ways others might or might not perceive. The mountain remained above, unchanged by any number of ascents, as sacred after millions of pilgrims as before the first. Modern tourism has transformed some sacred mountains. Olympus can be hiked by anyone with reasonable fitness. Fuji sees hundreds of thousands of climbers annually. The pilgrimage has become recreation for many, though traditional pilgrims still climb with traditional intentions. The mountains do not distinguish between tourist and pilgrim, receive both without comment, offer the same views and difficulties, remain as they have remained across millennia. But some mountains remain sacred in ways that resist the tourism. Kailash has never been climbed. Attempts have been planned and cancelled, and many believe the mountain itself prevents ascent. Uluru in Australia is now closed to climbing at Aboriginal request. The traditional owner's sense of its sanctity finally recognized by those who had treated it as attraction. The tension between sacred mountain and accessible summit is unresolved, is perhaps unresolvable, is part of what it means to live in a world where some places feel holy and modern culture treats all places as available. We close at dusk on a sacred mountain, having climbed in imagination what many have climbed in body. The sun descends toward horizon below, painting clouds in colors that seem celestial, that seem to justify every claim of divine presence. The mountain holds us in its silence. Whatever gods once spoke here speak no more in words we can hear, or speak still in language we have forgotten how to understand. The mountain where gods once spoke, the summit where heaven met earth, the pilgrimage that was journey and transformation simultaneously, forever high above the ordinary world, forever receiving those who climb, forever asking whether we approach with proper reverence, whether we seek what the sacred offers, whether we can hear what the gods might still be saying if we knew how to listen. The mountain, the silence, the sacred height, forever watching over lands below, forever inviting ascent, forever teaching that some places are holy, that some journeys are spiritual, that some ascents lead not merely to summit, but to something beyond altitude, to encounter with the numinous, to contact with the divine, to the transformation that pilgrims have always sought and mountains have always offered. The mountain where gods once spoke, still speaking, still waiting, still sacred in its silence. Before paradise was metaphor, it was place, or so the ancients believed. A garden where everything grew in abundance, where labor was unnecessary, where death had not yet entered, where the boundary between human and divine was soft and permeable. The garden that was paradise. The word itself comes from Persian, paridaitza, meaning enclosed garden. The Persians built such gardens, walled spaces where water flowed through channels, where fruit trees shaded geometric plantings, where the order and abundance contrasted with the arid landscape beyond the walls. The garden was civilized space, controlled nature, human triumph over wilderness. The garden was also sacred space. The kings who built gardens were claiming divine authority, were creating earthly reflections of heavenly order, were demonstrating the power that could make deserts bloom. The hanging gardens of Babylon may or may not have existed. Ancient writers described them: terraces rising above the city, trees growing on artificial mountains, water lifted by machines to irrigate the plantings. But archaeologists have not found them. Perhaps they were real, destroyed completely by time and conquest. Perhaps they were legend, attributed to Babylon because that city represented Oriental splendor to Greek imagination. Perhaps they were somewhere else entirely. Some scholars suggest they were actually in Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, confused with Babylon by later tradition. The mystery persists. The image persists. The idea of garden raised above the earth, of paradise suspended between heaven and ground, endures regardless of whether such a garden actually stood. The Garden of Eden enters Scripture as primordial space, the place where humanity began, where God walked in the cool of the day, where the tree of knowledge bore forbidden fruit, where everything was perfect until it was not. The location was debated for centuries. Did the four rivers described in Genesis refer to real geography? Was Eden in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow? Was it in the highlands of Armenia, where those rivers begin? Was it purely mythical, a spiritual reality that physical geography could not contain? The search for Eden's location reveals the power of the garden image. People wanted it to be real, wanted the place where humanity began to be findable, visitable, perhaps even recoverable. The longing for paradise is longing for return, for the state before fall, for the innocence before knowledge, for the garden we left and cannot re enter, the cherubim with flaming sword guard Eden's gate, and we stand outside, imagining what we have lost. The gardens people actually built were attempts to recover paradise, to create spaces where abundance and order prevailed, where the struggle that defines most human existence could be suspended. The Roman villa garden, enclosed by colonnaded walls, centered on fountain or pool, planted with herbs and flowers and fruit trees, was such an attempt. The Islamic garden, dividing its space into four quarters, representing the four rivers of paradise, directing water through channels that made the garden seem alive, was such an attempt. The medieval European cloister garden, enclosed within monastery walls, medicinal and contemplative, was such an attempt. What did it mean to enter such a garden? It meant crossing boundary from ordinary to special, from work to rest, from chaos to order. The walls mattered. not only for practical purposes of irrigation and microclimate, but for symbolic purposes of demarcation. Inside the wall was different from outside. Inside was cultivated, ordered, beautiful. Outside was wild, unpredictable, ordinary. The garden was refuge, was restoration, was taste of something better than the world usually offers. The gardens also demonstrated power. Only the wealthy could afford them. The water systems, the labor, the land dedicated to beauty rather than agriculture. The king's garden was statement of authority as much as space of pleasure. The nobleman's garden was social marker as much as private retreat. The garden was luxury, was excess, was what remained after necessities were satisfied. To have a garden was to have more than enough. But gardens are fragile. They require constant maintenance. The water must flow, the weeds must be pulled, the trees must be pruned. Without care, the garden returns to wilderness. The order reverts to chaos. The paradise is lost. The abandoned gardens of history testify to this fragility. Overgrown estates, dried channels, walls, crumbling under the pressure of unpruned trees. The garden exists only through continuous effort. Paradise requires work, even if the work is hidden from those who enjoy the result. We walk now through an ancient garden in imagination. The water still flows through channels lined with blue tile. The fruit trees still bear pomegranate and fig, apple and pear, though no one now tends them. The geometric beds are overgrown, the boundaries between sections blurred by plants that have escaped their assigned places. The garden is still beautiful, but its beauty has become wild, has incorporated the wilderness it was built to exclude. What did those who walked here long ago experience? They heard the water, the gentle sound of flowing channels, the music of fountains that made heat bearable. They smelled the flowers, rose and jasmine, the ancient garden scents. They tasted the fruit, picked ripe from the tree, sweeter than anything that could survive transport to market. They felt the shade, relief from sun that otherwise dominated this landscape. The garden offered sensory pleasure that was also spiritual statement, that order could be created, that beauty could be cultivated, that paradise could be approximated even if never fully achieved. The irony is present even in the beauty. The garden was built by laborers who would never enjoy it as owners did. The water systems required infrastructure that demanded resources from surrounding populations. The abundance of the garden was extracted from abundance elsewhere, was concentration of wealth in specific location at expense of general distribution. Paradise for some, required work from others. The garden, beautiful in itself, was embedded in systems that were not beautiful, that involved exploitation and inequality, that sustained the few at cost to the many. This tension runs through all garden history. The most beautiful gardens were created by the most powerful, and power was not achieved through beauty alone. The gardens of Versailles were created by a king whose reign impoverished France. The gardens of the Mughal emperors were created by rulers whose conquests caused immense suffering. The garden, as escape from the world, was built through engagement with the world's worst aspects. Paradise has always been complicated. We close as dusk settles over the imagined garden, the water channels catching last light, the trees becoming silhouettes, the flowers folding closed until morning. The garden will continue through the night, will receive moonlight, will hear owls and night insects, will persist in its beauty without human witness. In the morning, the gardeners will return, will continue the work that keeps wilderness at bay, will maintain the order that makes the garden possible, the garden that was paradise, the enclosed space where abundance reigned, the symbol of what we lost and hope to recover, forever requiring maintenance, forever beautiful in its fragility, forever reminding us that order is achieved, not given, that paradise requires effort, that what seems effortless in its beauty is in fact the result of continuous labor, visible or hidden. The garden, the water, the trees, the walls, forever offering refuge from ordinary world, forever requiring the ordinary world to sustain its extraordinary existence, forever teaching that paradise is possible and fragile, that beauty can be created and must be maintained, that the garden we seek is never simply found, but always made, always requiring the work we would rather forget in the enjoyment of the result. At dawn and dusk, at noon and midnight, the bells rang. Across medieval Europe, across Buddhist Asia, across every culture that used Mount to mark sacred time, the bells called the faithful to prayer, to meditation, to attention to something beyond ordinary concern. The bells that called the faithful, the sound that shaped time itself. A bell is simple technology, metal shaped so that striking it produces resonant tone, the pitch and quality determined by size and composition and shape. But the bell's effect exceeds its simplicity. The sound carries across valleys, over rooftops, through walls. The sound compels attention. Something in human hearing responds to bells, alerts to them, cannot easily ignore them. The sound marks time. Before clocks were common, bells divided the day, told people when to work and when to rest, when to pray and when to sleep. The Christian church bell was voice of the church itself, calling the community to worship, announcing festivals and funerals, marking the canonical hours that structured monastic life. Matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, compliant before sleep. The bells rang for each, dividing the day into periods of prayer, reminding monks and nuns and the faithful beyond monastery walls that time itself was sacred, that no moment should pass without consciousness of God. The bells of Buddhist temples serve similar function through different theology. The deep resonance of the temple bell announces Dharma, invites attention, calls mind from distraction to presence. The bell at dawn and dusk the bell at beginning and end of meditation, the bell that punctuates chanting. Each sound is reminder to wake up, to be present, to attend to what the mind so easily forgets in the flow of ordinary thought. The Adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, is not bell, but voice. The muezzin's cry from minaret, broadcast now through loudspeaker, but for centuries sung from towers that still stand across the Muslim world. The words are declaration and invitation. God is greatest. I witness that there is no God but God. I witness that Muhammad is God's messenger. Come to prayer, come to success. 5 times daily the call sounds, structuring the day around worship, reminding the faithful of obligations that transcend whatever else occupies them. What did it mean to live in a soundscape structured by sacred sound? We cannot fully know. We who live amid sirens and traffic, music from devices, the constant noise of mechanical civilization. But we can imagine silence broken by bells. Imagine the day divided not by clock hands, but by tones that reach everyone simultaneously. Imagine community created through shared hearing of sounds that meant the same thing to all who heard them. The bells created sacred time within ordinary time. When the bells rang, whatever you were doing was suspended or could be suspended, should be suspended if you chose to respond. The merchant could continue bargaining. The farmer could continue plowing. The mother could continue nursing. But the bells reminded them that another dimension existed, that the transaction and the plowing and the nursing were occurring within a larger frame, that God or Buddha or whatever they believed awaited their attention whenever they chose to give it. The bells were also community. When the bells rang, everyone heard, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all heard the same sound at the same moment. The bells did not discriminate, did not ring differently for different hearers, created brief equality of hearing that the rest of social life denied. The peasant and the lord heard the same bells, were reminded of the same obligations, stood in the same relationship to whatever the bells announced. The casting of bells was sacred craft. Founders who made great bells were respected artists, their bells inscribed with prayers and dates and dedications. The consecration of a new bell was liturgical event. The bell was blessed, was given a name, was incorporated into the religious life of the community as if it were itself a participant rather than merely an object. Some bells became famous, were said to have special powers, were believed to drive away evil spirits or to bring rain or to work other wonders. The bell was not mere instrument, but was sacred presence, was voice of the church or temple in literal sense. The silence of bells is itself significant. When invaders melted bells for cannon metal, when revolutionaries removed bells as symbols of religious power, when fire destroyed bell towers and the bells they housed, the silence was traumatic. Communities that had structured their lives around bell sound suddenly had no bells. The day lost its shape. The boundaries between sacred and ordinary dissolved. Some communities could not rest until new bells were cast, until the silence was filled, until the ancient rhythms were restored. We sit now in imagination beneath a bell tower, waiting for the bells to ring. The hour approaches. We can sense it in the quality of light, in the position of sun, in the accumulated experience of countless days, structured by this same anticipation. And then it comes, the first stroke, felt as much as heard, the metal speaking across the landscape, the sound spreading in waves that reach everyone, that exclude no one, that announce that this moment is marked, is noticed, is sacred. The bells ring their pattern. Each church had its own rhythm, its own sequence, its own way of distinguishing its call from neighboring churches. The sound layers and echoes, fills the air with resonance that continues after the last stroke. It fades gradually into silence, more profound than the silence before the bells began. What do we feel in that silence? Relief, perhaps. The bells demanded attention, and attention is tiring, but also something else. Gratitude, perhaps, or peace, or simple awareness that we have been called, that we have heard, that we have participated in something that connected us to all who have heard these bells across centuries, all who will hear them in centuries to come. The bells that called the faithful, the sound that shaped time, the technology so simple and effect so profound, forever ringing in the churches and temples that still stand, forever silent in the churches and temples that have fallen, forever teaching us that time can be sacred, that sound can be prayer, that community can be created through shared hearing of call that invites us, calls us, reminds us that something waits for our attention whenever we choose to give it. The bells, the towers, the time they created, forever ringing, forever reminding, forever calling across distances that are geographical and temporal both, reaching us from centuries past, asking whether we hear, whether we respond, whether we allow the sacred to structure our time as it structured the time of those who cast the bells and those who rang them. On monuments throughout the ancient world, names are missing. Where inscription once proclaimed achievement, chisel marks show where names were removed. Where statues once displayed features, faces have been defaced. Where records once preserved memory, gaps appear where text was scraped away. The names that were erased, the attempt to make someone not only dead, but as if they had never lived. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. When an emperor fell from power, when a politician was convicted of treason, when the powerful decided that someone should be forgotten, they did not merely kill, they erased, ordered names removed from inscriptions, ordered statues destroyed or defaced, ordered portraits removed from public spaces, ordered records amended so that the condemned name would not appear. The punishment extended beyond death into memory itself, attacking the immortality that Romans sought through reputation and commemoration. The practice was ancient before Rome and continued after. Egyptian pharaohs erased predecessors. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled Egypt for 20 years, had her images defaced by her stepson Thutmose III after her death, her cartouches removed from monuments, her statues destroyed, her memory attacked as thoroughly as her political power could command. The reasons are debated. Perhaps misogyny, perhaps dynastic politics, perhaps something we cannot recover from the evidence. What we can recover is the attempt, the systematic effort to make it seem she had never ruled, never built, never been. The effort failed, of course. We know Hatshepsut's name. We know her reign. We know her temple at Deir el-Bahri, magnificent even in its mutilation. The very effort to erase her created evidence of her existence, the chisel marks testifying to what was removed, the gaps in records indicating what was once there. Damnatio Memoriae contains paradox. The attempt to destroy memory can preserve memory, can make the condemned more notable for having been attacked, can turn erasure into its own form of commemoration. The Christian emperors erased pagan predecessors. Julian the Apostate, who tried to restore traditional religion after Constantine's Christianization, had his memory attacked after his death. His policies were reversed. His supporters were punished. His memory was condemned. Yet we know Julian better than many emperors who were not condemned. The very controversy he generated preserved information about him that routine reign might not have generated. The question is whether memory can truly be destroyed. The evidence suggests not, or not completely. Names erased from monuments persist in manuscripts that escaped destruction. Faces defaced on statues are known from copies that survived. Records thought destroyed are recovered from archaeological excavation. The totality that Damnatio Memoriae sought, complete removal of the condemned from human memory, seems impossible to achieve. Something always survives. Someone always remembers. The attempt to erase creates its own archive. But for the ordinary, for those without monuments or inscriptions, erasure is easier. The peasant who left no written record can be forgotten completely. The worker whose labor built the monuments is unknown, while the kings who commanded the labor are remembered, and even they can be partially erased. The selectivity of memory is not only political, but structural. We remember those who were commemorated, forget those who were not, know the names of rulers, while the names of millions are simply absent from the record. The violence of erasure extends beyond the physical attack on monuments. There is violence in being forgotten, in having one's existence treated as expendable, in living and working and dying without anyone thinking to preserve the memory. The pharaoh whose name was erased, at least, was known enough to warrant erasure. The laborers who built the pyramids are forgotten without any specific act of damnatio memoriae. are forgotten simply because they were never remembered, because the systems of commemoration did not include them, because their names were never inscribed. We contemplate an ancient monument where a name has been removed. The outline remains, the cartouche shape, the space where glyphs were carved, the absence that indicates presence. We can see that someone was commemorated here. We cannot see who. The erasure has succeeded in removing the specific name while failing to remove the evidence that a name once existed. What was the crime? We often cannot know. Sometimes the condemned was guilty of genuine offense, treason, murder, abuse of power. Sometimes the condemnation was political, the new ruler destroying memory of rival, the faction in power eliminating record of opponents. The justice or injustice of particular erasures is often beyond our ability to assess. We see only the result, the gap where name was, the silence where praise was, the absence that speaks of presence now denied. The impulse to erase continues. Modern totalitarian regimes have removed disgraced officials from photographs, have rewritten histories to exclude the inconvenient, have attempted the same total memory control that ancient damnatio memoriae attempted. The results are similarly mixed. Some erasures succeed, some create martyrs, some preserve through opposition what they meant to destroy. We close before the defaced monument, running fingers over chisel marks that testify to ancient rage or ancient politics or ancient desire to control what would be remembered. The erasure has been here for centuries, millennia perhaps. Generations have stood where we stand, have wondered what we wonder, have felt what we feel before this evidence of human desire to control memory itself, the names that were erased, the faces that were defaced, the memories that were condemned, forever present in their absence, forever speaking through their silence, forever teaching that memory is contested, that the past is not simply given, but is constructed and fought over, that what we remember and what we forget is not accidental, but is shaped by power, by politics, by the decisions of those who control inscription and destruction, the chisel marks, the gaps, the silence where names were, forever testimony to the war over memory that accompanies all political history, forever evidence that to exist is not enough. One must also be remembered, must also be inscribed, must also be preserved against the forces that would make existence as if it never was. Before maps showed continuous coastlines, before anyone knew with certainty that the earth was round, before the great age of European exploration, other sailors set out into unknown waters. They sailed without knowing what lay ahead. They risked the edge of the world, if there was an edge, to discover what could be found. The ships that sailed beyond the edge. The Polynesians achieved the greatest expansion in human history before modern times. From origins in Taiwan or Southeast Asia, they spread across the Pacific, to Hawaii, to New Zealand, to Easter Island, to thousands of islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean. They did this without metal, without writing, without instruments. They navigated by stars and swells, by bird flights and cloud patterns, by knowledge accumulated over generations and transmitted through song and practice. They found islands that were specks in vastness, islands they had no reason to believe existed, and they settled them, and from them launched further voyages, and gradually covered the largest ocean on Earth. How did they do it? The question has fascinated scholars for decades. The navigation techniques have been partially reconstructed, the star paths that linked islands in memory, the ability to read ocean swells and detect the patterns caused by distant land, the observation of birds and clouds, and phosphorescence that indicated islands beyond sight. But the techniques alone do not explain the courage. What drove people to set out into open ocean with no certainty of finding anything? What made them willing to risk death by thirst or storm or simple failure to find land? Perhaps the question assumes fear that they did not feel. Perhaps for Polynesian navigators, the ocean was home rather than void, was filled with knowledge rather than emptiness, was navigable through skills that made the unknown known before arrival. The ocean that seems terrifying to us, trackless, featureless, deadly if one is lost, was perhaps readable to them, was perhaps as familiar as forest paths to forest peoples, was perhaps risk, but not unreasonable risk. The Phoenicians may have circumnavigated Africa more than 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama. According to Herodotus, Egyptian pharaoh Necho II commissioned a Phoenician fleet to sail from the Red Sea around Africa and back through the Mediterranean, a voyage of approximately 3 years. The details Herodotus reports include the crucial observation that the sun appeared on the wrong side of the sky as they sailed around the southern tip of Africa, which would indeed happen, which Herodotus dismissed as impossible, which actually confirms the voyage's accuracy. The Phoenicians knew things that Mediterranean scholars thought impossible because they had sailed where scholars had not gone. The Norse reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. The sagas describe Vinland, the land of vines, variously identified with Newfoundland, New England, or points between. Archaeological evidence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland confirms Norse presence around 1000 CE. The Vikings sailed without knowing what they would find, followed reports of land cited by storm-blown sailors, established settlements that did not survive, but that proved the voyage was possible. The Chinese fleets of Zheng He sailed the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century, 60 years before Columbus, with ships far larger than any European vessels of the time. The fleets reached East Africa, the Persian Gulf, the coasts of Southeast Asia. They mapped, they traded, they demonstrated Chinese power, and then they stopped. The voyages were discontinued, the records were destroyed. China turned inward, and the great age of Chinese exploration ended before its implications could be fully realized. What was it like to sail beyond the edge? To set out knowing that you might not find land, might not survive, might simply sail until supplies ran out and death came slowly of thirst or starvation, the courage required is difficult to imagine from the safety of mapped world, satellite navigation, rescue services. The ancient sailors had none of this, had only their skills, their vessels, their companions, and whatever faith or resignation or hope sustained them. Some sailed for profit, believing that valuable goods awaited in unknown lands, that the risks were justified by potential rewards. Some sailed for necessity, driven from their homes by overcrowding or conflict or environmental change, seeking new lands because old lands could no longer support them. Some sailed for glory, seeking fame that accrued to discoverers, the status that came from finding what no one had found. Some, perhaps, sailed from curiosity, wanting to know what was there, unable to rest until they had seen for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. We imagine standing at the prow of a ship sailing into unknown waters. The land behind has disappeared below the horizon. The sea extends in all directions, featureless, borderless, offering no clues about what lies ahead. The sun rises and sets. The stars wheel overhead. The ship sails on, trusting navigation that has no landmarks to check, trusting the ocean to reveal what it hides, trusting life to continue long enough to find whatever waits. The fear must have been present, at least sometimes. The knowledge that return was not guaranteed, that the voyage might end in death rather than discovery, that the edge, if there was an edge, might be closer than anyone thought. The sailors must have prayed, must have told stories to pass the time, must have watched the horizon for any sign of land, must have felt hope rise and fall as days passed without discovery, and then land. The first sighting, bird flight perhaps, or cloud formations that indicate an island, or the changed color of the water, or finally, the unmistakable shape of shore rising from the sea. The relief, the joy, the knowledge that the voyage had succeeded, that the risk had paid off, that beyond the edge was not ending but beginning. New land, new possibility, new world. We close as the imagined ship approaches land. The voyage is nearly over. The sailors who set out, not knowing what they would find, have found something: an island, a continent, a place that existed, but that no one from their homeland had ever seen. They will land, will explore, will decide whether to stay or to return with news of what they found. The edge of the world has retreated. What was unknown is becoming known. What was feared is becoming familiar. The ships that sailed beyond the edge, the sailors who trusted their skills against uncertainty, the courage that made discovery possible, forever inspiring those who wonder what lies beyond the known, who feel the pull of unexplored territory, who understand that discovery requires risk, and risk requires courage, and courage requires setting out without knowing what will be found. The ships, the sailors, the edge that kept moving as they sailed toward it. Forever the human spirit that cannot rest until it knows what is there, that sails into darkness, trusting that light waits somewhere, that believes the world has more to offer than what is already known. The ships that sailed beyond the edge, forever sailing, forever discovering, forever teaching that the edge is never where we think it is. Every story ends in silence. Every civilization, however magnificent, falls quiet eventually. Every voice that speaks will cease to speak. Every sound that fills the air will fade into the stillness that receives all sounds and preserves none. We have traveled tonight through lost cities and forgotten scripts, through temples where gods once spoke, and libraries that burned to ash. Now we arrive at the destination that all our journeys share, the silence that remains. The silence is not empty, it is full, full of everything that has ceased, everything that was and is no longer, every voice that spoke and speaks no more. The silence of Ur is not the same as the silence of Pompeii, is not the same as the silence of Angkor. Each silence holds different history, different sounds that are now absent, different lives that were lived and are now complete. We walk through ruins one final time. Not any specific ruins, but all ruins, the composite image of human achievement and human transience that every ruined place evokes. The walls stand or have fallen, the streets are visible or buried, the monuments remain or are fragments, or are memory, or are forgotten. Whatever the specific state, the silence is present, the silence that was not always there, the silence that came gradually or suddenly, that crept in through abandonment or crashed in through catastrophe, the silence that remains when everything else is gone. What do we hear in this silence? If we listen carefully, we hear the absence of what was once present, the absence of voices that once spoke here, that bargained and prayed and whispered love and shouted anger, the absence of footsteps that once crossed these streets, that carried bodies now dust, that moved with purpose, now unrecoverable, the absence of music, of laughter, of weeping, of all the sounds that humans make when they are alive and are living their lives in all the ways that lives can be lived. The silence is not indifferent. It receives everything, receives the ruins and the air that moves through them, receives our footsteps and our breath, receives our thoughts, though they make no sound. The silence was there before humans came to this place, was interrupted by thousands of years of human habitation, has returned now that humans have gone. The silence is patient. It waited through all the noise of civilization, and it remains now that the noise has ended. Is this sad? Perhaps. The cessation of life is always loss, always the end of possibility, always the foreclosure of futures that will not now occur. The people who lived in these ruins, whoever they were, wherever they are, hoped for things they did not achieve, feared things that did or did not happen, loved and lost, and wondered about what lay beyond their horizon. Their hopes are gone now. Their fears are gone. Their love is gone. Only the silence remains. But perhaps sadness is not the only response. Perhaps there is peace in this silence, acceptance, the recognition that endings are part of existence, that everything that begins must eventually end, that the silence that receives civilizations will eventually receive us all, and is not enemy, but simply fact. The ruins do not mourn themselves. The stones do not grieve. The silence simply is, neither cruel nor kind, neither just nor unjust, simply the condition that follows the condition of sound. We have learned tonight that civilizations are fragile, that cities can sink beneath the waves, that scripts can become unreadable, that libraries can burn, that roads can lead nowhere anyone remembers, that names can be erased and bells can fall silent and ships can sail beyond the edge and find what? More coastline, more ocean, eventually the end of discovery that all voyages reach. We have learned that nothing is permanent, that even the most impressive achievements are temporary, that the pyramid and the ziggurat and the temple will eventually be ruins, will eventually be dust, will eventually be silence. But we have also learned that humans keep trying, keep building cities, even knowing that cities fall, keep writing, even knowing that scripts are forgotten, keep storing knowledge, even knowing that libraries burn, keep setting out on voyages, even knowing that many voyages fail. The impermanence does not stop us, perhaps because we do not believe it applies to us, perhaps because we hope for exception, perhaps because building and writing and exploring are what humans do regardless of outcome. We cannot stop being human, cannot stop reaching for permanence, even knowing we will not achieve it. The silence that remains is also the silence that waits, waits for whatever comes next, for new civilizations that will rise in places old civilizations fell, for new voices that will speak languages the old did not know, for new sounds that will fill places that are now silent. The silence is not ending but interval, not death but rest, not emptiness but possibility. The silence that received past sounds will receive future sounds. The ruins that are silent now may be rebuilt, may ring again with voices, may live again in ways we cannot foresee. We close sitting in the ruins as night deepens. The stars emerge, the same stars nearly that ancient peoples watched, that they aligned their temples to, that they believed were gods or dwellings of gods or messages from powers beyond human understanding. The stars do not care about our ruins, do not notice our silence, will continue their ancient wheel whether anyone watches or not. But we watch, we notice, we sit in the silence and feel it receive us, include us, hold us in its vast patience. Sleep approaches. The journey through forgotten worlds is complete. The voices of ancient peoples have spoken what they can speak through ruins and artifacts, through the traces they left that somehow survived. Now they return to silence, return to the condition that is the final condition for all voices, all sounds, all civilizations, all that exists and then ceases to exist. The silence that remains, the stillness that receives, the peace that waits in all ruins, that will wait in our ruins eventually, that is not enemy, but simply is, forever silent, forever patient, forever the destination of all journeys, the ending of all stories, the rest that follows all exertion, the silence, the remains, the night that deepens toward sleep. Rest now. The ancient world has given what it can give. The silence receives us as it receives all things. And in the silence, if we listen carefully enough, we might hear something, might hear the sound of all the sounds that are no longer, the echo of all the voices that have ceased, the presence that remains when presence seems absent, the silence that remains, forever remaining, forever complete, forever the ground on which all other sounds are heard and to which all other sounds return. Sleep now. The silence holds you. The ancients are at rest, and somewhere in the stillness, everything that was is still somehow present, still somehow here, still somehow speaking in the only language silence knows. Good night. The end.